Welcome, everyone. My name is Timothy Patrick McCarthy. I'm the host and director of the A.R.T. of Human Rights, which is a new collaboration between the American Repertory Theater and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. This series is sponsored in part by a project grant from Mass Humanities, and it is meant to use the arts and the humanities to explore some of the most pressing human rights issues of our time, with leading artists and activists and academics. I want to mention, before we begin, the musical prelude, the music you were listening to when you were coming in, were songs from the long Black freedom struggle. And we wanted to play those songs because of the importance of music to that struggle and to the civil rights movement in particular. The scholar Charles M. Payne has written, "I once heard a journalist who had covered the movement remark that 2 decades after its height, the civil rights movement had inspired no great works of art, no great novels or films, no great plays." He rather missed the point, Payne said. The movement was its own work of art. For this evening's conversation on art and history and politics, I am joined by 4 distinguished guests. To my far left is Professor Lani Guinier, the Bennett Bosky Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. To my immediate left is Robert Schenkkan, the Pulitzer Prize-winning and Tony Award-winning playwright of All the Way and its sequel, The Great Society. To my immediate right is Dr. Lisa Coleman, the Chief Diversity Officer and Special Assistant to the President here at Harvard University. And to her right is Dr. Professor Peniel E. Joseph, Professor of History and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts University. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Welcome. Our topic tonight is All the Way, ? The unfinished struggle for civil rights. I want to begin, Robert, with you and ask you to reflect with us out loud. Not really. That's the point of it. I know we're in trouble. If you could reflect a little bit about the journey that All the Way has been for you. How did you come to be inspired to write All the Way and now its sequel, The Great Society? What about the history of LBJ and the civil rights struggle that you think would make great theater? And is there something in particular about the stage that called you to create this art?
I'll try to do this very briefly. LBJ has been in my head for a long time. I grew up in the Hill Country in Austin. And he is, I tend to think of him in present tense, such an extraordinary, indeed, Shakespearean kind of character. Bill Moyers once described him as the 11 most interesting people I ever met. And I don't think that's far from the mark. So there was that, but really it was the opportunity in this story, in All the Way, this pivotal, critical year, 1964, to explore issues that have fascinated me for some time, and that is power and morality, politics and civil rights. This is just an extraordinary, this year, the individuals all involved here, Bob Moses, Dr. King, Fannie Lou Hamer, Hubert Humphrey, Senator Richard Russell, and of course LBJ. It's really a hinge point in American history. Everything changes in this year and is never the same. It is hard to imagine another year in which the political parties completely switch positions on a major issue. And it results, of course, in a major realignment of the political geographical landscape of the United States, and begins a cycle which I would like to think that we are perhaps only just now emerging out of. So that's why.
And what about the theater as a place to create this kind of history?
Well, you know, unfortunately, politics and history get kind of a bad rap in this country. I think people tend to think of history as just one damn thing after another. And politics as a bunch of people yammering at each other on the television, and of course, neither is there critical. Of the Faulkner school that history is not dead, it's not even past. continues to live through us, it continues to affect us, and you ignore it at your own peril. And politics shapes everything. Politics has never mattered as much as it matters today. Theater, because it is immediate, because it is live, because it is so visceral, I think gives one an opportunity to really reveal how muscular, how bloody, how intense the political struggle actually was and is, the sausage making of politics. And in doing so, you know, it's not just a hell of a good story, but you hope to provoke in people a desire to learn more about this. Is this true? Did this really happen? Is this the way it happened? And to provoke them to undergo their own campaign, their own search for the truth, and attempt to change society. I don't think there is any more important thing that the arts can achieve than to bring an audience really viscerally, intellectually, emotionally into an experience of their own culture, of their own society, and then hopefully send them out charged up to explore that and hopefully take action as a result of that personal exploration.
Thank you. Now, Lani, Neil, and Lisa, I wanted to ask you a question. The 1960s, of course, was a remarkable time, and Lyndon Johnson was a remarkable man. And the civil rights struggle was, of course, a remarkable movement. And yet this moment and this man and this movement were also remarkably complex, as we see in All the Way and as we know from studying the things that we've studied. And yet these complex, remarkable things also have a deep relevance and resonance in our own lives. In the last several years, we've been celebrating 50th anniversaries. It seems like every month there's another anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs for Freedom, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, John F. Kennedy's assassination, LBJ's elevation to the presidency, the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Mississippi Freedom Summer, and we will continue to have these anniversaries. And so, Lani, beginning with you, and then moving to Camille and then Lisa, from the vantage point of history, but also amidst the fierce urgency of our present moment, how do each of you assess the meaning and significance of the civil rights struggle?
How many words?
Whatever you want. Just as long as it's out loud.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a crossword puzzle.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to think about the civil rights movement in contemporary terms because in many ways what we've done is to simply think about the civil rights movement as Martin Luther King's speech, "I have a dream." And he had a dream and he might have had some nightmares, but he didn't share them with us, and all of a sudden we're now this much better society because we have a black president and we have people of color, not just black people, but Latinos and South Americans, people from India, who are all now part of our society. But what I think is missing from our understanding of the civil rights movement and thinking about it in the context of current challenges, we tend to think that the problem is simply individual rather than systemic. So we tend to think that if we could just convince white people to like black people, that would somehow solve the problem. Now, it certainly would be helpful to know that you have, friends of all kinds, but and I certainly, encourage people to have good friends of a different race or sex or whatever the caricature may appear. But what we have failed to do in terms of the civil rights movement and in terms of not just our interpretation of it, but in terms of the ways in which we are moving forward, is that this is a crisis that is about the Constitution of the United States. The Constitution of the United States, and when I say that, I mean the double entendre of the United States Constitution that was drafted in the 18th century by all white men, most of whom, or many of whom I should say, owned slaves. And at least if you think about the conservative Republicans who are on the Supreme Court, the way in which they are implementing the quote-unquote Constitution of the United States is as if we should all follow whatever the rules were back in the 18th century when the people writing that Constitution owned slaves. So my point, I don't want to take up too much time, but my point is that this is a problem that involves substance and systems, not simply individual prejudice or individual ignorance.
Neil? Yeah. Hello?
Yep.
Oh, people can hear me. Okay, great. One, thanks for the invitation, and it's great to be on this esteemed panel. I'll start off with how do we define civil rights by speaking. One, I'm a historian. I'm one of the people who Robert was talking about in terms of how people think history is just a bunch of damn stuff, and I think you're right. Even my students sometimes think I'm just teaching them about a bunch of damn things that happened in the 19th and 20th century. When we think about the civil rights movement, though, the movement is actually a movement for radical democracy. And I think, how do we define radical democracy? Ella Baker, who's the founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a sharecropper turned civil rights activist, they defined it in specific ways about poor black people being able to decide for themselves how they were going to live, right? Not just participate by voting in Mississippi, Alabama, but really by being architects of the democracy. 50 years later, what has happened, what has transpired? I think the interesting thing about the legacy of the civil rights movement is just really how contested that legacy is. Because on one level, that legacy has been appropriated by political figures and elected officials, right? And certainly that appropriation includes Barack Obama. I mean, I think one of the interesting parts about being alive in 2014 is the way in which the President of the United States is both an inside and outside figure. Many people think of him as a civil rights activist because when he ran in 2008, he said, hey, I was a community organizer. He talked about the Joshua generation. He talked about, he had a deep understanding vis-a-vis, he said he read Taylor Branch, right? Our friend Taylor Branch, and Parting the Waters. He said he understood the civil rights movement. His memoir talks about SNCC, talks about these civil rights activists and how he wanted to be an organizer. He was inspired to be an organizer. And I think that insider-outsider status has been very confusing for both black people, political progressives of all stripes, because the same person who's saying he really valorized Martin Luther King Jr., saying the fierce urgency of now. When people said, well, why are you running? You were only a state senator for 2 years. You've only been a US senator for less than 3. Why are you running? He said in 2008, I'm running because of the fierce urgency of now. And that's what Dr. King was saying in 1967, 68, when people were saying, why are you speaking out against the Vietnam War? When Dr. King was saying that militarism, materialism, racism were the triple threats against humanity, right? Now, at the same time that he said he was doing this and he was anti-war, as president, there's been transformations. As president, he's the leader of the nation state. So there's multiple wars that continue. There's drone strikes and thousands of people being killed because of drone strikes. There's an inability to have redistributive policies, except for health care, but certainly nobody on Wall Street got punitive action against them. There was no bailout for homeowners, but there was bailout for Wall Street and for automakers. Yet at the same time, this is the same person who's saying he's got the mantle and he respects the mantle of the civil rights movement. So I think what we've lost is an understanding that the civil rights movement was not a popular movement. Even though, yes, it's a grassroots movement, but most people in the United States of America, at least, and I'm just saying empirically, just data-wise, they were not in favor of civil rights. They weren't in favor of radical democracy. They were in favor of the status quo. You were on the cutting edge of social and political movements when you said you were for civil rights. And 50 years later, what's happened, and I've gone to DC and looked at the King Memorial, and it's beautiful and different stuff. But King, who now we've appropriated, was one of the biggest critics of American democracy and the nation state, right? King dies trying to do a poor people's campaign, right? So even though we have this polarity between Malcolm X and Dr. King, King is a huge critic. Ella Baker is a huge critic of American democracy and American, institutionalized racism. So I'll wrap up by saying the interesting part of where we're at is that civil rights has become a bedtime story. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Barack Obama. So there's people say Rosa sat so Martin could walk, so Barack could run, so your children could fly. Right? That was a little ditty people were saying in 2008. And that sounds great, but it's not the truth. It sounds fantastic, but it's not the truth. And people don't want to hear the truth. They want a bedtime story with a beginning, middle, and end. And Barack Obama is a successful, happy ending. So part of this is about the civil rights movement's legacy being this cultural appropriation instead of its real legacy of social and political struggle that continues. The movement doesn't die in the 1960s. It continues to this day, but it's how do we choose to remember this movement as Americans?
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. So I'll pick up where Camille sort of left off, is that when we think about the civil rights movement, I think we have to think about civil rights movements, right? That these were a series of localized, initially movements and actions coming together, galvanized, then to create a movement, as we might. And so those struggles were localized. And if we think about civil rights struggles even today, we've seen some of those localized struggles, most recently in the cases of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Misha McBride, etc. And so as we think about the struggle, which is what is the meaning and urgency today, what comes to mind are the things that remain consistent in the systematic and systemic issues that we need to examine. Police brutality, banking, housing, some of those, the same similar issues, differently configured, as Lani has already referenced, in terms of the systemic and systematic nature in which they arise today. And so there are differences between civil rights struggles of yesterday and today, but yet what we know is that the systems of militarization, of the way that gets adopted into police systems, into so-called democratic practices, that's where we need to think about the urgency and re-examining the definition of civil rights today. And let me say this, when we think about the civil rights, and this was referenced earlier in terms of particularly African Americans, and we think about where African Americans are today, and I want to draw particular attention to some of the things that Peniel mentioned, because of the people who were sort of left out of the movement, right? Left out in the reconstruction of the movement, and that is the bedside story. So the names that sort of get lost in that, and I think that's crucial, because if you think of somebody like Claudette Colvin, who sits on the bus at 15 prior to Rosa Parks, that is an important story because it's a legacy, a story for our children about what it means to be an activist as a young person, to move into that role. And losing those stories loses a wealth of then what it means to struggle and continue that struggle in an everyday and ongoing manner.
Thank you all. Now we're going to segue into a couple of clips from All the Way. Many of you, I'm sure, how many of you have seen the play here? David, okay, so a good chunk of you. We've all seen it as well. But we're going to show, we all have to. You've seen it? I hope so. You wrote it, I think, yeah. And we're going to play two clips from Act 1. The first clip is a conversation, a tense conversation between LBJ and Martin Luther King in the Oval Office. And the second clip is a heated conversation among five civil rights leaders: Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Bob Moses, Stokely Carmichael, and Roy Wilkins. And it ends with an encounter between LBJ and Hoover following that conversation. So we're going to roll both of those clips back to back and then react to them.
My people are deeply concerned, Mr. President.
I understand.
You promised the country a civil rights bill, and the voting rights component is critical.
Absolutely critical. We're going to fix that. Just not in this bill. Now, right now, we're going to take care of segregation in public accommodations first. Did you know that every year my cook, Zephyr Wright, best damn chicken fried steak you ever put in your mouth. But every year, she and her husband, they drive my Packard from Washington back down to the ranch for me. Well, now, Zephyr is college educated and all, but she can't use any restrooms along any of those highways because they're all whites only. She got to squat in a field by the side of the road to pee like a dog. And that's just not right. And by God, we're going to fix that.
The Civil Rights Bill of 1957 was supposed to fix that.
Well, if you're going to quote my record, sir, you got to quote the whole thing. I'm a Roosevelt New Dealer at heart. As a matter of fact, John F. Kennedy was a little too conservative for my taste.
Well, I don't need to tell you how significant the Negro vote was in President Kennedy's election.
President Kennedy was always very appreciative of your vote.
He didn't have my vote. Georgia officials declared I hadn't lived long enough in Atlanta, and Alabama officials said it was too late to vote absentee. Voting rights matter, Mr. President. Nothing will ever really change in this country until Negroes can vote.
The next bill will be voting rights.
You know, after President Kennedy's election, Eisenhower publicly declared that his party had taken the Negro vote for granted, and I would hate to see the Democratic Party make that same mistake.
Wow, if you think Barry Goldwater is a legitimate heir to Abraham Lincoln, you should vote for him. But civil rights isn't the only thing I'm interested in, Dr. King. We got people in this country living in unbelievable poverty. I know. I grew up like that in the hill country, picking cotton on my hands and knees, harnessed like a mule to a road plow, living off the bitter charity of my neighbors. No silver spoon in my mouth like Bobby Kennedy. But I got a dream, you see, where we change all that. We're going to declare a war on poverty, and by God, we're going to beat it.
A war on poverty?
That's right. Now, I got all kinds of federal programs in mind on health, education, literacy, jobs, you name it. We're going to change this country top to bottom.
That sounds extraordinary.
There you go.
See, I would very enthusiastically support legislation to that effect. But right now, I need to be able to go back to my people and tell them that this president is committed to civil rights and that this bill, even without voting rights, will still be a strong bill with no further changes. Now, if I can't do that, I will lose their faith. And in their despair, I don't know what will happen.
Is that a threat?
Certainly not. I don't want any spontaneous demonstrations on the street any more than you do. But in order to avoid that kind of situation, I need to be able to deliver meaningful reform.
Okay. Now here's what I need. The bill is stuck in Judge Smith's Rules Committee, and I need at least 8 votes, Walter, to pry it out. 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Walter, give me a list of names. Now you get your people in each one of these districts, your ministers, your clergy, your union supporters, and what have you, to lobby these representatives to release that bill. Oh, now, lobbying is just like propositioning women, you know.
I'm not sure I understand.
I knew this fella. Boy, he was a real ladies' man. He got more pussy than you ever saw. I said to him, what is your secret? He said, well, I go into a bar and I ask each woman if she'd like to go out. I said, boy, you must have got slapped a lot. He said, oh, hell yeah. but I also got me a lot of yeses. Now we only need 8 yeses to get this bill out of Judge Smith's committee. All right. All right.
Can you tell us what meeting that was, like what the date was?
I can't give you an exact date because of course.
I don't mean the, just the month.
We're very shortly after LBJ has become president, so we're probably January, February 1964.
The reason I ask is because after King won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he came back to talk to LBJ about a Voting Rights Act, he was told by LBJ's vice president directly that it was too soon. They had just gotten the '64 Civil Rights Act, and they weren't going to get the Voting Rights Act that quickly. And that's when King went back to Selma and started sitting in with the other students. And he ended up writing a piece in the New York Times with a little small.
There are more Negroes in jail here with me in Selma than there are on the voting rolls.
Correct.
And so this scene actually precedes
Yes.
the moment that you were talking about, yes.
Yeah, that precedes that, and then this scene shows some of the factions that are developing within the movement once King comes back with that news.
He said he'd get it out of committee, and by God he did.
And all it cost us was the voting rights section. Hell, let's just declare victory and go home. If you spent a little less time in the Mississippi backwoods, Stokely, and a little more time in the back halls of Congress, well, maybe you'd understand how things work.
Oh, I understand how things work, Mr. Wilkins. See, the house Negro always thinks he's better than the field Negro.
Don't you get up on your hind legs with me. I was working for the cause while your mother was still wiping your ass.
And accomplishing what? Exactly. I mean, aside from getting yourself invited to the White House for tea.
Every major legislative and judicial victory of the last 50 years has been the work of the NAACP. Like the deaths of those 4 little girls in Birmingham.
Oh, I see. We're going to blame the victim for the lynching.
I think
Gentlemen, this is not helpful. Given our success extracting the bill from Judge Smith's committee, the president has asked for our continued assistance in lobbying Congress. Now, I don't see what we have to lose in doing so. In fact, there is much to be gained, not just now, but for the future.
Do we have to endorse his candidacy?
What, are you leaning Republican this election, Bob? Goldwater came out against civil rights.
Purely on constitutional grounds, you understand? Personally, Goldwater deplores racism.
Well, I think asking for my vote while denying me the right to vote is bullshit.
The bill still gives us a lot.
Unless he gives that away too.
So I have his word, there will be no more compromises.
His word? Are you serious?
He's made Humphrey floor manager of the bill.
And you know he's on our side.
And Johnson knows that if he breaks his promise, there will be demonstrations all over the country.
No, there will most certainly not be.
But until this bill passes, Roy, we have to hold his feet to the fire. While he's running for election, he doesn't want us in the streets.
And that's the leverage we have.
It's only a threat if you're willing to use it, Doc. If he doesn't deliver, will you support a public action?
I will be in the street myself. Now, will Snick work with us?
I can't support a bill without voting rights.
I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you not to work against it.
That's the second.
Look, the president is also planning new legislation that will bring a huge federal intervention in poverty, hunger, and jobs. Think about what that would mean to our people.
He said that to you.
He called it a war on poverty.
40 acres and a mule. What if he's just sweet talking you till the election?
What if it's serious?
Okay, we won't campaign against the bill for now. But Snick isn't going to ring any doorbells for LBJ neither.
Fair enough.
But we're not going to sit on our hands.
What does the visionary Bob Moses propose? You got another march planned? Walking from nowhere to nowhere, accomplishing nothing.
No marches, no demonstrations. I'm not sure that works anymore.
Instead?
Freedom Summer. We send hundreds of student volunteers down to Mississippi, flood the state with our people to educate and register Negro voters.
Mississippi? You are out of your ever-loving mind.
And not just black volunteers, white students too.
Worse and worse. If just one of your white volunteers gets hurt, you will do irreparable damage to the cause.
Whereas if one of our Negro volunteers gets hurt, who gives a fuck? Yeah, there may be trouble. That's the point, isn't it? When Dr. King talks about surfacing evil for all the world to see, what he means is deliberately provoking some redneck to bust my head on national TV.
That is an absurd reduction of Dr. King's philosophy, Stokely.
The Birmingham campaign was dying until you put children on the street in harm's way. Dogs biting kids, children being blasted with fire hoses. That got the press all excited, didn't it? That got the president's attention. And if it takes some white kid getting smacked around to shed a little light on the darkness that is Mississippi, well then why not?
Because people will die in Mississippi.
People are dying in Mississippi.
Those deaths will be on your head. I cannot support this.
Nobody's asking for your permission,
All
Roy.
right, let's calm down. I think we can all agree nobody here is going to have to do something they can't get behind. But there's nothing that says we can't move ahead on multiple fronts at the same time. Now, we should respond to the elimination of voting rights and Freedom Summer. It's a great way to do that. At the same time, Roy, you're right. The bill still gives us a lot, and nobody in this room has your legislative experience clearly. You and the NAACP should take the lead on our lobbying effort in D.C. Meanwhile, SCLC will mobilize religious leaders and our labor allies to bring pressure to bear at home. That way, we're not going to give them a moment's rest anywhere.
We need funding.
Here it comes. Big talk, then both hands out.
We'll help.
Come on, how are we going to help
Just
with
arrange a
this
few more
thing?
speeches.
You already
At
booked
this
up to
point,
the
what
end of the
difference
month.
does it make? All right.
All right.
All right.
All right, gentlemen. Woo! One of these days, Stokely and Wilkins are just gonna kill each other. Right here in the middle of the room. Wilkins, I'm so
Well, in that case, we'll sell tickets and maybe I can stop giving speeches.
Your breakfast meeting tomorrow with the Catholic Interracial Council has been changed to 8. Carl will pick you up after for your speech in Cincinnati to the International Union of Laundry Workers. Afternoon flight to Cleveland, Martin, and the United Synagogue of America dinner. Next morning is Western Michigan University. You need anything?
I'm fine.
Good night then.
Is the coast clear?
Give me a minute.
When you're ready.
This tape will kill the burrhead. I want to highlight it. You'll send over to Walter Jenkins at the White House immediately. There's no way the president can ignore this.
The sack man preacher.
His hypocrisy is disgusting. The man is a flagrant adulterer.
Oh my, Southern preacher who fucks his choir. Who ever heard of that? Jay, if you arrested every politician and preacher who ever strayed from the marital bed, wouldn't be nobody in Congress or the pulpit. Now, what a man gets up to in his privacy is his own business.
His moral turpitude is just the tip of the iceberg.
Jay, far be it for me to tell you how to do your job, so keep an eye on him, sure, but while I'm trying to get this bill passed, this is not helpful. You understand me?
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Call the surveillance teams off.
It's our job to protect the president from his enemies and from himself. Expand our surveillance. Find me another way to expose King.
So there's a lot going on in those two scenes. The relationship, obviously, between LBJ and Dr. King, the relationship between party politics and protest politics, the ideological, generational, and tactical factions and tensions within the movement itself, federal surveillance of radicals, King's sexual infidelity, Johnson's folksy sexism and racism and vulgarity, the preoccupation among Democrats with losing the South if the Civil Rights Bill proceeds, various stakes and consequences that are involved in political and moral actions of high stakes. And I'm wondering if you could each respond to whatever you saw in those. No, you first, Lisa. We'll go in reverse order this time. You, and then Neil, and Lani, and then Robert. What's your reaction to those scenes? All that's going on in such a short period of time.
3 words?
No, 4 or 5. Yeah.
4 or 5. Well, you're right. So there's a lot going on, and so the first are the multiplicity of issues, obviously, and of course one is reminded of the multiplicity of issues today, right? Whether you think of the subprime mortgage issues, police brutality, rates of unemployment amongst African Americans, health issues and health disparities, etc. And so that to me is one of the first things that sort of came forward, is that there are different factions. There are people who think we should be focusing on different issues at different moments, and that will lead us to freedom, if you will. And there are definitely factions within African American communities and from without. The issue of surveillance, which is the one that comes up, I think is paramount, and to really think about how surveillance is operating today. And this is not just the Eric Holder reference, but in a larger sense of how Black bodies are surveyed and brutalized. And this is through media attention, lack thereof. And when I say lack thereof, what I mean is if we think about the 64,000 missing Black girls today, and the kinds of things that are missing in the news, and the things that we cover, which of course has to do with what we survey and those things that we don't. And then lastly, the thing, I have to bring this up because one cannot sit on a stage and hear pussy said so many times and not think about gender. And so the question of gender here is a really relevant one, I think, and particularly because as I think about LBJ, and it was interesting the question that Lani asked earlier, because on December 31st of 1963, right, that's when LBJ decides to take Jerry Whittington to the 40 Acres Club in Texas to desegregate, right, the club. And that's his action. And the story goes something like this. He takes her to the club, and this is a moment where he's, as they're walking into the club, several people ask, do you know what you're doing? He says, yes, of course. Some people are going to think you're my wife, and that's okay. And what's interesting to me about this moment is the use of the Black female body, right, and how it gets used or misused and utilized, and then the female bodies in the screen. And so there are a couple of points I would like to sort of just bring up here. And one is that even as we reconstruct the civil rights movement and civil rights struggles, the bodies that often drop out and are not discussed are those Black female bodies, and how and the ways in which, even when we think about the beginning of the civil rights movement and the precursors of lynching and the lynching of Black women, and then when we move into this use of Black bodies, and particularly the use of quote unquote in the boys club, the use of the words like pussy, etc., in this exchange of masculinity around, right, and to some degree it is very much about that posturing that leads to, right, for me, to suggest perhaps that one of the issues that is not explored in the scenes that we might have considered is this issue of gender and the ways in which Black women's bodies get used and reused for various subject matters in this discussion of civil rights.
I think the thing that stands out for me is the intergenerational dialogue that's going on between movement figures, and you know to amplify what Lisa's saying, that yeah, women aren't in that scene, right? Although women are big leaders, but I think to compare it with where we're at today, I think the interesting part is that you couldn't imagine today a major civil rights figure who is respected by as panoramic a group as Dr. King was respected meeting with the president and being able to leverage that kind of political power and respect in our own time. And I think we're really impoverished because of that deficit, right?
And then to be able to go back to various
Exactly.
stakeholders
Yeah.
who are very much at odds with one another about
Yeah.
tactics and strategies and broker that
And broker that, exactly.
and play that role.
Yeah, and I think we're impoverished by that today, and I think one of the biggest conflations sometimes people have, I said this in my earlier comments, is that somehow Obama is that leader, right? So you know, because you look at the, one thing missing from Steven Spielberg's Lincoln movie is Frederick Douglass. You know, Frederick Douglass.
That wasn't the only thing that's.
You know, but I'm saying I think that's the biggest thing. I think that's the biggest thing, Tim, because Frederick Douglass met with Lincoln 3 times, and like right around the period that's being discussed in that movie. He had that moment with Lincoln, and with King. King has moments with both JFK and LBJ, and I think one of the biggest problematics of how we view Obama is that Obama is Lincoln and JFK and LBJ. He's not that oppositional figure, but many people desperately want him to be that figure.
Lani?
Yeah, I'm not sure I completely understood what you were saying in the context of the oppositional person.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that people, especially the black community, there's a feeling that one of the reasons why people want Obama to be defended, and they don't like a criticism of Obama, is that there's a conflation of Obama the president with Obama the community organizer, and Obama as a critic of the U.S. nation state, right? He's not that. He's the president of the United States, and at times just the aesthetic of him being the first black president confuses people, and some of that has to do with his memoirs and what he articulated when he was running. He was the first president who ever said, look, I was a community organizer. I understand the civil rights movement. He suggested that as president, that would inform his actions, right? And that's not necessarily been the case. So there's this kind of conflation with Obama, the president, chief executive, versus Obama, the activist.
Okay, so I think part of what you're saying is that the civil rights movement itself was not engaged in changing circumstances for poor black people. It was really a movement about middle-class black people, more so than you would expect. Certainly there's Fannie Lou Hamer, and there are people who struggled from having no resources to being proud and also prepared to defend and to argue against the then conventional distribution of power. But I say this in part because of an interesting foreword to a book that Andy Young, one of the key civil rights actors who worked very closely with King, he wrote that the civil rights movement was in effect a middle-class movement to give middle-class blacks their class privilege. Right? To give middle-class blacks their class privilege, so that it may seem to be a movement that is empowering poor black people, not just middle-class black people, but in retrospect, that's the way he's looking at it. And I think that there's a lot of truth to what he's suggesting. And even though it was called the Poor People's Campaign or the Poor People's effort, it was the middle-class people who benefited from the civil rights movement, and in part, that's why you still have so many poor black people throughout the country who have access to very little, including access to an elected official who is going to represent their interests in a way that is actually their interest as opposed to the elected official's interest in simply getting elected again and again.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think I would push back against Andy a little bit in the sense that, so I think, and this is Lisa's point about the movement being a movement of movements, in the sense that there's national welfare rights organizations, certainly Stokely and people like Judy Richardson and others are in Lowndes County, they're in Mississippi. So poor people are a huge constituency. Stokely says he loves Dr. King because he got along so well with poor people, right? But I do agree that as the movement becomes more incorporated and assimilated and really sort of a victim of representative democracy. It becomes, there's different levels of brokers who are coming back and saying, okay, here's what poor people want.
And I would just put scare quotes around the term representative democracy. It's unrepresentative
Absolutely,
democracy.
and I agree. I agree with that completely.
Robert, what do you have to say about this?
Well, a couple of things. I guess, and perhaps this is my own lack of understanding. I always saw the poor people's movement as an evolution in Dr. King's thinking, and that it has always struck me that when the movement began to deal with issues of class, that this is when he was assassinated. And I don't necessarily think that's a coincidence to me. Yeah, that this has always struck me that this is when he becomes really dangerous. So I want to say that. I also want to say to Professor Coleman, I think your observation about women's bodies and the absence of any real dealing with that in the play is a legitimate, it's absolutely an acute observation, a legitimate criticism. Unfortunately, it's
and let me say, I was not critiquing the play, actually. I love the play. I was actually making a more general comment about the conversations at the time and the general sort of movement, not specifically the play.
Who gets access to realms of leadership?
Precisely,
Play roles of the broker and so forth, and gets marginalized within that.
Exactly. That's
yeah, because part of what I'm trying to achieve in those two scenes, the scene with Dr. King and OBJ, and then the scene with Dr. King and the various movement leaders, that I think we do somewhat successfully is people tend to, white people tend to think of Dr. King either as the orator or the martyr, and there's not nearly enough appreciation for Dr. King, the strategist, the tactician, and the politician. And I think the attempt here is to show what a difficult hand he had to play. It's not much of a hand when it's only useful every 4 years. How skillfully he managed to play it, and how complicated and conflicted the movement, the civil rights movement was. It was a series of individual localized movements led by very charismatic and independent individuals who were not all that thrilled to be working together, and that he was able to bring them together for as long as he was, I think it really is an extraordinary tribute to his political acumen. And so that's one of the things that we attempt to do here, is to kind of bring that out in that scene.
Well, and also, if you think about gender and also sexuality more broadly here, and the way that it is mapped onto this distinction between private and public, right? That the private philandering of Johnson and King, right? And Johnson even admits it there. He says, if you take every politician and preacher who's screwing their flock, you're going to have an empty pulpit and an empty Congress. And that's a point that he's making in private, right, to his people, and that idea of keeping those things private is a way to preserve, in a sense, male power as it relates to leadership. And that when you have women who become prominent in the movement, or who become visible and potentially prominent in the movement, you mentioned Claire Cohen, and even Rosa Parks, certainly Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and so many others, the women of the Montgomery bus boycott. Once these folks become visible, they become a threat. And sexuality, when it becomes visible or known, becomes a threat. And I'm not just thinking here with the surveillance about King's affairs and others' affairs, and the way that the threat of making that public was such a treacherous terrain for King and others. But also when you think about Bayard Rustin getting caught in the back of that car, right? Having sex with another man. I mean, the reason Bayard Rustin, who was the genius organizer, alongside Ellen Baker and others, was a genius organizer, never had the prominence in the movement, is because he was homosexual, and he was known to be. And there's even part of the play, there's Walter Jenkins in the play gets caught enact a sexual act with another man, and then is forced to resign, and Johnson sort of turns on him. And these ways in which gender and sexuality become visible and therefore become a threat to the male power of this movement in this moment is really
and
important.
surveillance is different in different forms in these instances, right? Because there's internal surveillance, there's external surveillance, and the ways in which those get operationalized, particularly in this case of Rustin, operate differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to transition now from Act 1 to Act 2. We're going to play 2 shorter clips here, and then transition to a conversation more about the present.
Sir, they found Cheney's body.
Mississippi a better place. I know what you have suffered in this state. I know the heavy burden of sorrow.
Yes, sir.
The unbearable sadness that you carry in your hearts. But things are going to get better. You walk together, children, and don't you get weary. But if we're going to be free as a people, we have got to shed ourselves of fear. And we've got to say to those that opposed us with violence, you cannot stop us by burning a church.
Come on.
Oh, you cannot stop us by shooting at us. You cannot stop us by brutalizing us, because we're going to keep on.
As I stand here, I not only blame the people who pulled the trigger or did the beating or dug the hole with a shovel. I blame the people in Washington, D.C. or down to the state of Mississippi for what happened. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
You hear me? Now I'm sick and tired of going to funerals with black men who've been murdered by white men.
It's all right, son. It's all right.
Are you sick and tired of this stuff like I am? I'm not feeling sad tonight. I'm not feeling sorrowful. I'm not feeling forgiveness. I've got vengeance in my heart. And I ask you to feel angry with me. Are you angry? Are you? You feel what I'm feeling in my heart because I'm feeling vengeance in my heart. Now I'm sick and tired, and I ask you to be sick and tired with me. The white men who murdered James Cheney are never going to be punished, and I ask you to be sick and tired of that. We can't allow people in this country to allow that to continue to happen. We got to stand up. We got to stand up. The best way to remember James Cheney is to demand our rights. You hear me? Demand our rights. Don't just look at me and go back home and tell folks you've been to a nice service. Your work is just beginning. If you go back home and you take what these white people in Mississippi are doing to us, if you sit down and you take it, then goddamn your soul. Stand up. We gotta stand up in Meridian. Stand up. We gotta stand up in Jackson. Stand up. We can't imagine. Stand. What we gonna do? Stand up. What we gonna do? Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up. Stand up.
The convention has to seat our delegates.
It's not that simple.
Yes, it is. You don't understand the depth of feeling out there. There are serious divisions growing in the movement. Now, if my people decide that nonviolence is worthless, I will not be able to control them. It may already be too late.
Support the MFDP.
Support the MFDP.
Seat our delegates.
see our delegates.
I forgot to preface preface that that clip is a scene at the Union Baptist Church. It's a funeral scene of James Cheney, who was one of the 3 civil rights workers killed in Mississippi during Mississippi Freedom Summer in Meridian, Mississippi. And that's David Dennis, who interrupts King's sermon in the middle of that, in the middle of the funeral service. And the second clip here, which we're about to see, is Hubert Humphrey meeting in Atlantic City at the Democratic National Convention with civil rights leaders, including Fannie Lou Hamer, and then it transitions at the very end to LBJ.
Dear Mr. President, stop. Why does seating the Mississippi Freedom Party matter so much? Stop. For all the disenfranchised millions of this earth, those in Mississippi and Alabama, or behind the Iron Curtain, or suffering the apartheid in South Africa, recognition of the Freedom Party would say to them that yes, somewhere in this world, there's a nation that cares about justice. Stop. The hour is late. The time is now. Stop. Conscience demands that you publicly join us in seating the Freedom Party delegates. Stop. Yours sincerely, Dr. Martin Luther King. Stop.
All right. A lot of time and energy have gone into making this happen. The plan is to seat everybody,
Hey!
all 68 of your people, as honorary delegates.
Honorary? What does that mean?
You wouldn't vote, but you would have all the other rights and privileges of any other delegate.
No,
and a clear written promise from the Democratic National Committee that 4 years from now, every delegation, not just Mississippi, but every delegation must be integrated.
So you're telling these people to wait some more?
The MFDP can accept no less than equal votes at the convention. The time has come for Negroes to speak for Negroes to represent Negroes.
No, I have to disagree with you, Bob. If your position is true, then representative democracy is not real. And this cannot be a society in which we all live in peace as brothers.
Integration and enfranchisement are not mutually exclusive. This is not what we're talking about, Senator.
After everything we've been through, the MFDP has earned a right to be seated.
As full delegates.
I don't disagree, in principle.
In principle.
You all know what kind of man I am. I came out in 1948 for civil rights. I've worked my whole life for civil rights. And I can do a lot more, a voting rights bill, if I'm the vice president. But if we can't see reason together here, the president has made it very clear that's not going to happen. And who will he pick? Well, it will certainly be someone a lot less sympathetic to the cause.
Senator Humphrey, you're a good man, and you know what's right. Trouble is, you're afraid to do what you know is right. How can you think being vice president is more important than 400,000 black people's lives?
Mrs. Hamer, I never said that.
No, sir, but that's what you mean.
You're trying to get the Freedom Party to sell out.
I'm trying to get the most supported president since Abraham Lincoln re-elected. I walked into the lion's den. I argued fervently. I used all the heartstrings I had, and I made no headway. The least I think they might accept would be giving them some actual votes. A few votes.
What did King say?
He was mostly quiet.
After everything I did for him, he should have stood up for me. Why didn't somebody stand up for me?
I stood up for you, Mr. President.
Somebody who matters.
Well, if my loyalty's not important to you,
Oh, Jesus! You are so thin-skinned. I depend on you, Hubert. You know that. There's got to be a solution here. Okay, now, maybe we can get one or two of the Mississippi regulars to agree to step aside, claiming they're sick or something, so nobody thinks we pressured anybody.
Would Jim Eastland go for that?
Jim's become a tad more helpful since I stepped on his pecker. Listen up. Okay, you can tell them they can have 2 voting delegates. We'll call them at-large delegates. But one of them has to be that white minister of theirs with a smashed-in face.
Reverend Edwin King?
Yeah, him. That way it's one white man and only one nigger. We're going to integrate their delegation. Who can argue with that?
I'll see what I can do.
Don't see what you can do! Do what I tell you to do!
One quick aesthetic point about this play, and particularly Bryan Cranston. I remember the first time I saw it here, when it was running here. My father said to me in admission, I think, or maybe it was after the play, that how slight Bryan Cranston is compared to LBJ, and that we didn't notice it until he was in his underwear on stage. That it was when he didn't have his pants on that you realized, oh wow, he's not of the physical stature of LBJ, and that no one had noticed it because he had such a remarkable performance. But more substantively than that, I want to think about these clips in the context of the current moment. And one of the things that there are several things that struck me about these scenes. The first, in the Union Baptist Church funeral scene in Meridian, Mississippi, the David Dennis disruption of that funeral service, the moment when King is becoming aspirational, he can't stop us, we will continue on, and he stops and he expresses his anger and his pain and his suffering, and he says, I can't go to another funeral of a black man who's been killed by a white man. And then he moves throughout the audience and into the church and says, stand up, we'll stand up here, we'll stand up there. I saw a clip recently from Ferguson, Missouri, last weekend, where there was a church service where church elders in the movement were preaching from the pulpit, and the service was disrupted by young militants, young folks who were fed up, who articulated and expressed all of the pain and the rage and the suffering that David Dennis was expressing at that moment in 1964. And it was literally deja vu. I was picking the clips for today. I picked that because the clip from Ferguson last weekend and that scene, it was as if the folks in Ferguson had watched that scene and had used it as a template to choreograph the disruption that happened in Ferguson last week. And then there's a moment in the other scene where Fannie Lou Hamer realizes that the honorary delegates being seated means nothing. It's without any teeth in terms of voting. And voting is the key here. And she says, there are 400,000 people. Are you willing to prioritize your vice presidency over 400,000 people? And the recent voter ID law in Texas is going to, which was held by the Supreme Court this past weekend, Ruth Bader Ginsburg authors a blistering dissent, and she says it estimates that almost 600,000 people, registered voters in Texas, predominantly African American and Latino, are going to be disenfranchised in this midterm election cycle by this voter ID law that's been upheld by our Supreme Court. And it was striking to me that those numbers and also that moment of outrage are so present and current, and yet also so historical and ancient. And so I wanted to ask each of you a particular question. To Robert, I want to ask the big question, having worked and spent so much time with LBJ. What LBJ's complicated legacy would you seek to use to give caution or to give advice to our current president, who Guinier and others have talked about is in a quite precarious and complex position? What about LBJ's life and legacy can help President Obama in the last 2 years of his presidency?
Well, these comparisons are very, very difficult, of course, because the political landscape is so dramatically different. LBJ had a clear majority in both houses of Congress, and Obama does not. And it goes without saying that Obama is a black man, and LBJ was not. And that makes a difference. So, having said that, there's much that I like about President Obama, and then there are aspects that grieve me. I think he is more like Jimmy Carter in many ways as a president than LBJ. Like Jimmy Carter, not someone who really enjoys the rough and tumble of the legislative process, not someone who is comfortable with the pressing the flesh and the hand-wringing and the socialization that is critical to building and maintaining alliances within Congress in order to get one's legislative agenda passed. This is something that LBJ thrived on. This is what he loved. Indeed, there wasn't anything else really for him but the legislative process and the muck and mire of it. And so he succeeded brilliantly in his ability to get things done. I will also offer one other note in this, which is that LBJ was a master at taking advantage of a crisis. He never let a crisis go to waste politically. So that when something happened, he went to Congress and got a bill passed. And I'll just give you a very small but human interest story that was shared with me by Joe Califano Jr., who was his domestic chief of staff, and you had to be available 24/7 to LBJ. And the one time that Joe was not available, LBJ finally tracked him down, was yelling at him, "Where are you? Why aren't you here?" I just said, "I'm at the hospital. My son swallowed a bottle of aspirin, my toddler." And LBJ got very concerned. "Oh my God, how did that happen? I don't know. He just got the top off." And it was this moment, LBJ said, "They shouldn't make bottles like that." And 3 weeks later, they sent a bill to Congress to create child-proof bottles. I mean, this is the immediacy of action, legislative action, out of a moment. He, in the terrible aftermath of Dr. King's assassination, he pushes through a fair housing bill. Now, it's a very watered-down version, but he gets his foot in the door. In the aftermath of Bobby Kennedy's assassination, he gets a handgun law passed for the first time. So, and you look with President Obama after the terrible massacre, the schoolyard massacre in Connecticut, instead of immediately jumping on this and capitalizing on the widespread outrage and anger about this, a panel was formed. We talked about that we would investigate this, and the moment passed, and the NRA rallied, and we lost that opportunity. So, if there is an aspect here that I wish it would be that ability to capitalize on these brief moments, because the window opens and it doesn't stay open very long. So I guess that's off the top of my head.
And Lani, I want to ask you a question about voting rights and political representation, which of course you've written about in a small measure over your career. And could you talk a little bit about the current assault on voting rights and the voting ID laws that are being passed state by state by Republican legislatures and proposed, the voting ID law in Texas that was just upheld by the Supreme Court that will impact, if Justice Ginsburg's predictions are correct, 600,000 voters, 4.5% of registered voters in Texas, a disproportionate number of whom are Latino and African American, at a time when the Democratic Party is attempting to turn Texas at least into a purple state, if not ultimately an election cycle or two into a blue state. The gutting of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, where Justice Ginsburg wrote another blistering dissent calling denouncing the Supreme Court's hubris in that regard. She said that getting rid of the pre-clearance provision in the Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was akin to throwing away your umbrella in a horrible rainstorm because you weren't getting wet. And when we talk so often, the narrative of the civil rights movement, and of so many social movements from the 60s and 70s, is one of progress, and progress is inevitable, and we're just ultimately going to all get to the promised land at some point. And yet, it seems to me that our conversations about progress have to be really complicated right now, especially with respect to representation in politics and with the assault on voting rights that's going on, particularly among people of color in the United States. Can you speak to that a bit?
Only a bit.
Yeah. You're the person to speak to it.
It's hard to know where to begin. I would say that it's time for us to reconsider what the goal was of the civil rights movement vis-a-vis voting in light of current circumstances. So the message of the 65 Voting Rights Act, or of the Supreme Court decisions after the Voting Rights Act was both adopted and then it was extended in 1970, it was extended in 1982, 1975, 1982, and then again in the 2000s. What blacks and Latinos and other groups that have been disenfranchised, what everyone seemed to be seeking was the right to vote in the United States of America. And they were certainly entitled to that right to vote as citizens who paid taxes, as people who were part of the census, which is very important in the way in which we create House districts in the House of Representatives, because we count the number of people who are in a particular district, and we make that the district, even if the district has very little content or very little sense that it is a single-minded district. But my point is much larger, and that is our understanding of democracy is not just limited by the ways in which we are treating people of color or poor people. Our understanding of democracy is connected to a situation, the 18th century, when the United States essentially relied on upper-class whites, many of whom owned slaves. We're talking about George Washington, right? He owned slaves. He and others created a method of election that may have made sense to them in the 18th century, but if you go and look around the world, our system of voting is retarded. And I mean that seriously. It's ironic, because if you think about what happened post-World War II, when the United States was triumphant and went to Germany, which had lost the war, and introduced a new system of election in Germany, they actually did something that we would think, if it were done in the United States, was inadequate, was corrosive. And what did they do in Germany? They insisted that everyone in Germany get 2 votes. The first vote is a vote for someone to represent your geographical interests, that is where you live. And the second vote is for someone who represents your ideological commitments. So you get 2 votes, and you are then represented by 2 different people in the larger assembly. If you were to, and that was introduced by the United States and imposed on Germany. Or if you were to go to Canada, where they actually send out people to register people to vote as part of the census. So when they're going to determine how many people are there, they also ask, and are you registered to vote? And if not, here's the information you need, here's the voting registration form. We think that somehow there's something wrong with getting everyone to vote, as opposed to a system. So to me, we are engaged in an anti-democratic process of so-called living in an anti-democratic democracy.
Lisa, you mentioned, yes. Lisa, you mentioned the surveillance of black bodies and the policing of black bodies and the destruction of black bodies. We can say today what David Dennis said then, which is we're sick of going to funerals where black people are killed by white people. Ferguson, Missouri exploded this summer. The nation was called to account the summer before when George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. We have no shortage of examples of this. Throughout history, the first
song that you heard when you came in here today was Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, which spoke of the mutilation of black bodies a century plus ago. When Ida B. Wells, another freedom fighter, prophetic freedom fighter, was a lone voice in the wilderness for a long time, trying to get the country to do right then, and it never did. Will this ever end?
And what's that date?
Not a date, but I mean, how? Getting back to this idea of progress. I mean, with so many people, Americans are so deeply invested in the pursuits of happiness, in the aspirational ideals of the kids having a better life than their parents. We're so invested in that, and that it seems to so many people inevitable, particularly white people, I think, are invested in this. And yet, yeah.
So I think if we're going to talk about progress, then we have to talk about progress in terms of racial relations as well, right? It's just not a progressive narrative of the nation, right? We have to talk about what do race relations look like? And then I think we have to talk about state violence and militarism. And we have to think about how state-sanctioned militarism gets operationalized differently on different bodies, right? And particularly here, Black and Latino bodies. And so then if we're thinking about that notion of progress or progression, right, then I think we have seen great progress with militarism. I mean, it has progressed really in an amazing and fascinating way that we could study and unpack, I think, even further. But I don't think that's necessarily a narrative of progression about race relations, except for that race relations have become increasingly militarized, policed, bodies have become increasingly surveyed. And if we think about, to your question, will it ever end? I think that we would have to think about other things ending before we could think about the destruction and policing of black bodies. And so and I say this because earlier when I was saying this about the children, right, and I said 64,000 black girls are missing. 42% of all children who are missing are black. 42%. So what that suggests to me is that while we're in a conversation about violence, right, we're not having a conversation about all the violence, about disappearance, about who gets disappeared and then never seen or recognized or even thought of again, right? And that's what I mean about that 42%, and most people don't even know that, right? So, and that to me is about a state that we are increasingly militarized and we're interested in policing, but simultaneously we're not, that whole notion of protect and serve, right? And who gets protected and who gets served and who gets lost. And so I think, right, and yes, and of course who gets killed. And so when we think about the examples, so Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, so today I'm sure many of you saw the news and the most recent stories about Michael Brown, right? And of course, now it's a question of whether there was a struggle in the car, and did he have marijuana, and Trayvon Martin may have had marijuana, and so there's always this question about what the black or Latino body was doing or contained. Did they have 3.5 ounces of marijuana in the back, in the room, and then they were shot in the head? I mean, so there's always this question of, and so when I bring up these questions about race relations, what I'm really also asking the question is about how black people, black bodies are still thought of and represented. And it brings up again this question of who then gets to go missing. And so, will it ever end? I hope so. I hope that it ends. I'm a very, shall we say, pessimistically optimistic person. So I have great hope. But I do think that the conversations need to shift, and they need to shift around voting. They need to shift around how we even think about health, for instance, and health care, and who gets to access those kinds of things. And I think in that, then we can start to talk about who gets destroyed, who gets to live, and how you get to live, how one gets to live, right? And I'll say this lastly, it goes back to something that Lani said, right? If we're thinking about the civil rights movement as the middle class movement, and I think that it was, as a middle class person and coming from a middle class family, we were all in the movement. What I think there, however, is that we also need to have additional conversations about poverty and what poverty looks like now differently than it did in the 60s, and how that is affecting children, families, women, and men as well.
And Peniel, I'm going to ask you, I'm in the mood of asking big questions in this last cycle, and then we'll open it up for Q&A and discussion with the audience. The last question I have for you before we do that is, where does the change come from? Right? We had Sam Cooke was another one of the songs that we played. Change is going to come. Where does the change come from now? You've studied movements, you've studied leadership, you've studied the various tensions in the civil rights movement, Black Power movements up to the current day. Where does change emerge and leadership emerge today to give us a less pessimistic form of hope?
Well, I think I'm going to start with relating to a couple of those scenes we saw, because I remember when I saw the play the first time, I think the striking thing about the funeral in Meridian and Dave Dennis. One, just anecdotally, it's a play, it was a mixed audience, but predominantly white, right here at the A.R.T. And when the actor who's playing him comes down and is screaming, you saw a bunch of white folks look around like, is this part of the play?
He was right next to me. I almost got up and joined him, though.
They're like, is this part of the play? I mean, I'm like, this angry black man. He's just like in Cambridge, man. He's just mad. I'm like, so you saw all these white people, they're like, I saw a woman, she was like, she had like her purse, just like, I was like, man.
He's just acting.
He's just acting, right? But it really shows, in terms of this idea of black rage and this idea of anger and how these issues really mattered in the 60s then and now. But I think the interesting part, and then the next scene, when you see the horse trading about the MFDP, Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, is that there's all this anger, there's all this righteous indignation that's very much justified, and people dying, bleeding for democracy, I've called it, and dying. But the political system can't really handle, doesn't really have the solution, even policy-wise, even legal, like Lani was saying about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. And when we think about the change today, the interesting part, when you read about Ferguson, and I saw the clip that you were talking about, Tim, there's so much anger in Ferguson, right? And one of the reasons I would push back about saying, was the civil rights movement just middle class, is that you really did also have black nationalist movements, you had poor people's movements, you had labor activism. My mom's part of 1199, she's retired, SCIU. I was on my first picket line when I was 8 in New York City. And not everybody at SCIU was middle class. Most of the people in my mom's union, they cleaned floors, they scrubbed toilets in Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. So before Justice for Janitors and all this great stuff, there was 1199. So from my perspective, growing up in New York City, civil rights was about anti-poverty. We weren't part of the NAACP, but we were union members, right? So the interesting part about change now, it's young people, right? It's young people, but it's also specifically young people who we've got to get organized, who aren't part of the youth chapter of the NAACP, who aren't part of Al Sharpton's National Action Network, who aren't in college, right? There's a great story in the Washington Post about poverty in college and how so many people, even if they're getting to college, it's not about getting to college, it's about paying for college, especially folks who are lower income, right? So right now, it's going to come through young people, but it's going to come through young people whose ambitions and whose vision really outstrip this idea of political accommodation, right? So what's interesting about Cornel West, right? Cornel West, we know is this amazing public intellectual, but somebody who's also been very critical of Obama, so has really been criticized by the black community, right? Cornel West. Ostracized in some quarters, but his new book, Prophetic Fire, And he talks about Black prophetic fire and this tradition of Fannie Lou Hamer, Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker, Martin, Malcolm, all these different activists, but who were willing to speak truth to power, right? And right now, it's not that we don't have activism, we really do. We have activism nationally. If you go to Chicago, Boston, New York City, where I'm from, it's there. What we don't have is a kind of representative leadership for that activism. So we don't have people we can just click off the top of our heads and say, this person is running the Dream Defenders. Or, Majora Carter and is doing environmental racism stuff. Or the Occupy movement, but they were wanting to be leaderless for their own political reasons. So the change is gonna come, and it's coming, but it becomes, we are so used to it. This is where it goes back to what Lani was saying as a middle class movement. We're used to CNN, we're used to MSNBC, and we're saying, look, we wanna see it on Rachel Maddow, or we want to see it on Al Sharpton, Politics Nation at 6, or Melissa Harris Perry's got a brilliant show on the weekend, and if we don't see the activists there, then we don't want to hear about it. There's a problem with that, because Dr. King didn't have a television show, okay? There's a problem with that. Ella Baker wasn't on MSNBC. There's a problem when, in 2014, even as we talk about social media and social and political activism and how good social media is, we're only looking at certain specific venues for not just leadership, but social and political activism, for social and political critiques. And remember, if it's on MSNBC, the critique is gonna be contained. It's gotta be contained. You're not gonna get a bunch of socialists on MSNBC, or Marxists on MSNBC, or people who are saying, I'm a revolutionary feminist and an anti-imperialist, but also LGBT activist, right?
That's why we've never been on MSNBC.
Now I understand why we're not getting those calls.
Yeah. And so part of it, the change is going to come outside. I mean, one of the best stories coming out of Ferguson and St. Louis, and these neighborhoods in St. Louis after the Darren Wilson was shot, was how students at St. Louis University did their midnight rally. And they didn't ask permission. People were saying, what are you all doing, right? And it was after midnight. And they all converged, and it was thousands of people on the campus, right? They did that on their own, and they did that in the tradition of SNCC. They did it in the tradition of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, and all these other movements that we don't want to talk about right now, because I have the distinct feeling that for not just Black elites in the middle class, if it's not done, if social and political activism isn't done in a way that squares with them, whether it's a fundraiser, whether it's on television in the right way, whether it's a book that's coming out from the proper university press, the new Jim Crow, which I think is fabulous, right? It's not done in a specific way where then you can get a New York Times op-ed, it's gonna be legitimated. We don't wanna know about it. We don't wanna see it. And the biggest thing about the civil rights movement is that it wasn't done in that way. There were unspeakable, unspoken truths, and we need to look towards not young people who are going to be our leaders, but whose vision outstrips really the safety net that we're all looking for.
And that was part of the civil rights movement to begin with, is the youth pushing. It's like Zora Neale Hurston calling Du Bois doobies. I mean, it's that kind of notion, right? That there were these people who were pushing, whether it was Zora or Hughes or whoever, at any given moment, pushing those leaders forward, whether they were middle class or not.
Now I want to open it up for conversation with the audience. We have a couple of people who are going to have microphones that are going to run to folks as they raise their hands. We ask, because we're recording this, if you would wait for the microphone to come to you, and then identify yourself, and then ask as short a question as possible, and direct it to one of the panelists or all of the panelists if you can. The shorter the question, the more we can get in. So we'll take questions now. Okay. We're coming down here. Great.
Hi, my name is Meg. I am a local high school teacher, and I teach a lot of students of color. And my question is, how do I get students interested in developing this activist voice when they feel very apathetic towards the local political or federal, national political movement? It's just something they don't have a lot of faith in or knowledge of, and consequently don't want to participate in.
You said you're you teaching? Where are you teaching? Oh, teaching. Are you teaching in Cambridge? No, I think, it's funny because that question gets asked a lot. I was at the Schomburg in New York City, and there were black educators asking that about young people in Harlem and sort of getting them engaged with movement and activism. I think that, I think young people, and I've taught high school before teaching at university as well, I think they're always interested in the truth, and they're interested in the truth of the moment. So sometimes what you do with the lesson, what I did when I was teaching high school in Philadelphia was I always, I was teaching history and English, I always started with contemporary politics. So I started with what was going on, and I mean pop culture too. So we used to talk in those days about Biggie and Tupac before they were killed. And the students were receptive to that. So I think part of it is drawing them into the past and this narrative and this story through the present, including popular culture, whatever they're interested in, and also not dismissing whatever they're interested in, because part of it is we do that. Some people are going to say, hip hop is bad. No, it's not all bad. It's actually this really transformative culture. Certain strains of it have been used to promote deep misogyny, deep sort of gangster capitalism, but then there's others that are really anti-racist, anti-sexist, very, very progressive, radical politics. So part of it is contemporary, but then the other part is really sharing the story and the narrative of social and political justice, however you're doing that. I think somebody mentioned earlier, Bayard Rustin, we haven't talked about Audre Lorde, right? And there's so many of these black women. One of the things I've argued about Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright, is that she's the founder of the Black Arts Movement and not Amiri Baraka. So I say Lorraine Hansberry, if you look at A Raisin in the Sun, that's the Black Arts Movement, right? Way before, Amiri's in the Lower East Side when she's doing that, right?
Did you wait until Amiri passed, or did you say that?
No, I've said that, and I think Amiri Baraka is a genius. He's a genius. But I'm talking about Lorraine Hansberry. So part of it is like telling them the story in a narrative that you think is really going to excite them. That's what I'm saying.
Next question. Go ahead.
Corey Baker, also high school, local high school. I hear often that the movement or the change is coming from young people, and I feel like right now is the time for me to make that decision. Am I going to go into my next job that's my next 5 to 10 year commitment, or am I going to take a risk and come into a room like this and say we need to demand that the Harvard University president take a pay cut so more people can have scholarships? I want to hear about your personal experience with the struggle between choosing at a young age am I going to go for this career that I feel like is a path that is hard but is visible, or am I going to decide, am I angry and I'm going to be in Ferguson? I feel like I'm having that struggle now, and I wonder if you all are having that, and if where are you at with that?
So, it is a great question. Thank you for it. So I can't speak for everyone in the panel, but I think some of us are still angry. Even we're not probably 20 anymore. I didn't want to say anything, Tim.
So we're both 22.
Just had that birthday. But in thinking about, and it's funny you should raise this question. In fact, I just returned last week. I was in Montgomery and attending the inauguration of a new president of Alabama State University, and she is the first African-American female president of Alabama State University. Her name is Gwendolyn Boyd. And articles have been taken out about Gwendolyn Boyd. Some of you have been reading them, and they have been horrific, actually. And she's been attacked on a number of different levels. And I took a trip over to Selma as well. And I was reminded of my youth and of activism and a number of organizations. In fact, I was the head of the Audre Lorde Project in New York City for a number of years. And so this marriage between, and so I would like to discuss this as less of a choice, as more of how do you integrate and marry the kind of work that you want to do with your future aspirations. And so when I think of myself as a young person, and I worked in Texas in the HIV and AIDS, during the HIV and AIDS era, when people would not touch people who had AIDS or HIV in the hospitals, and this was during the mosquito era. I worked in battered women's shelters. I mean, really, my early years, and even today, I volunteer and work in a high school with African American and Latino students. And so I think that the question for me has always been, how do I continue the work that is about truth and is about giving to the larger world, the larger community that will make me better, right? It's not just about making everyone else better, but it makes me a better person in my teaching, in my learning, and in my engagement. And so this marriage for me, now it's easy because I'm a chief diversity officer, sometimes people say, but that was a circuitous path that I took to get there. And so I have several degrees, and those degrees weren't necessarily, I was studying in some of those degrees I was studying things that had nothing to do with what you might think of as traditional sort of activism or advocacy. But for me, it was to make sure that as I was doing that kind of work, for instance, I worked for Merrill Lynch in their philanthropic division. That is not exactly an activist role. It wasn't. And so when I left there and then had to trek across town, and this was in New York City from the World Financial Center, and then go over to Brooklyn to work with African American women in the Audre Lorde Project, that to me was about a marriage, right? And informing myself and my work so that as I went back to Merrill Lynch and discussed with them their philanthropic enterprises, how might they change some of those as we married my work and my experiences with that kind of work at Merrill. So that's my long-winded answer, but I think it has to be thought of more for me as a marriage and than an us versus them or an it versus the other.
I would just add to that sometimes I think, and I hear this talk, I talk to a lot of high school students, I do a lot of work in high schools and even middle schools, and I do a lot, obviously teach at the university, and one of the things that I hear from young people, high school students, college students right now, is they want to find the thing, right, the perfect fit, and then they're going to just sort of take off, and that's going to be their life. And one of the things that I think Lisa mentioned, and Peniel, I know both of them and their trajectories well, none of us have taken a kind of linear path to where we sit now. We've all done lots of different things, and the combination of the things that we've done that we've tried to make meaningful and have meaning and impact in the world and be true to a value system that we all share, has looked different at different times in our lives. And sometimes I can create enough space in the institution that I'm working in where I get my paycheck so that I can live a meaningful life within that institution. I don't need to find and search for meaning in other places. More often than not, that's not the case. And so I do my work and I get paid, compensated for that work, hopefully adequately with living wage, benefits, etc. And then I search for meaning in other places. I go to work in communities that I love, that nurture me, that I can nurture. I go to places where I can be in solidarity with folks who might need some of my work, and we work together to do something new. And that looks different depending on where I am and what time it is and what I'm doing. And so I think the thing I tell my students is stop fetishizing linear trajectories, upward linear trajectories, because most lives are not lived that way. The only linear trajectory that I can trace back is I can now make sense of my life backwards. But I can't make sense of my life moving forward, and I certainly couldn't make sense of my life the way it is now 20 years ago. And so the aspiration to that, I think, sometimes sets us up for frustration that we don't need to experience, because and that saps our energy to do the good work that we need to do in the world with one another. Next, yeah.
Hi, my name is Allison Bernstein. I work in politics, and with the election coming up in a couple weeks, everybody remember to vote. I was struck in the scenes from the play by both how proactive and how kind of broadly sweeping the legislation being discussed was, and how much faith all of these activists had in, if we can get the voting rights into law, into this legislation, that will be this, incredible difference and huge step forward. And I think that's, I think nowadays we have much more of a cynicism for some very legitimate reasons, as has been discussed, but I'm wondering if we can just for 2 seconds put aside the realities of our Congress and some of those other pieces. What kind of sweeping, proactive and not just, reacting to voter suppression, so we have to set in this law, but what kind of proactive, kind of great society of 2014 would you be interested in seeing going forward, and do you think would be effective on some of the fronts that we've been talking about tonight?
I think you have made a very astute point, which is that we tend to, in some ways, reproduce the status quo despite the fact that we're seeking to change it. And part of the reason we reproduce it is because our critique of it, our efforts to change it, are done as if you could simply change the biological makeup of the people who are leading. Meaning, you can have a woman lead or a black man become president, and somehow having those individuals in these important places becomes not only triumphant in the sense of opening doors, but it frankly reproduces the distribution of power, perhaps inadvertently, but that's what happens. So ultimately, you're opening doors so that black people or women can climb a ladder that had previously been closed to them. And in that process, you now have women who are in Congress, or you have many people guessing that we'll have at least one woman running for president in the next election. I think it's I think that your question is important, because what we really need to think about is not simply how do we change the diversity, the psychological or physiological diversity of the country. And we have to become much more fundamental about what is the problems that are, we can see those problems, we can visualize them when we see poor people or people who are less well educated. We see the challenges that they have to meet, and we think, oh, well, there's something wrong with them, each of them individually. But I would go back, actually, just to put this in a little context, with what happened in 1957 when the city of Little Rock, Arkansas, was being desegregated for the black children, were being desegregated by the presence of 9 black children who were going to be attending what was called Central High School. Now, what we don't realize about that desegregation of Central High School is 2 very important factors. The first is that the students who were still in Central High School, well, let me start from a different point. The first, I'll change the second point I was going to make, I'm going to make it first, because I think the context is important. At the same time that the black students were desegregating Central High School, the upper middle class whites built a new high school. And that high school was opened at the very same moment that Central High School was being desegregated. So, and who was building that high school? The doctors, the lawyers, the people with money. So what was experienced by many of the working class whites at that same moment is that it was not simply that black people were joining their institution, it was that their opportunity to fraternize with upper middle class whites was gone, because those people were now going to their own new high school that was built specifically to give them a way out of having to be in Central High School with black people. So this woman, Beth Roy, wrote a book called Bitters in the Honey, in which she reported that she interviewed the people who had been at Central High School in 1957, and she interviewed them 30 years later. They were still furious. They were still furious with the desegregation of Central High School because they felt that they were denied the opportunity to move upward because of the evacuation of the upper middle class white kids. But they didn't think of it in that way. They thought it was because the niggers came in and took away our school from us. So they focused on race rather than on the class issue that was also behind this redirection of funds, etc. Now, why is that relevant, or why is that important? Because in many ways, all we are doing in opening up Central High School is not necessarily ensuring that everyone has a great education or a great opportunity to be educated. What we are doing is reproducing the system that we are critiquing, and then we are reproducing that system with an illustration, or at least an image, that seems more fair, but in fact it's just reproducing the same problem over and over again. So my point, ultimately, is that we've been thinking about things in terms of making opportunity for individuals so that individuals can participate in a wonderful country called the United States of America. And I am not denying that this is a wonderful country, but I think it could be a much better wonderful country if it were to come to grips with the way in which we allocate privilege. And in this society, the people who are already quite well-to-do are in a position to reproduce themselves. People who are poor or middle class are not. And so it's not enough to just create, affirmative action opportunities. That I can give you a critique on that too. But what's fundamentally at the core of all of this is that we have to restructure the way in which we allocate power, and the way in which we allocate privilege, and the way in which we educate our citizens, so that all of our citizens can become leaders and can become people about which we are very proud. Whereas right now, what we have is a class division in which people with money are able to, quote unquote, buy their opportunity in higher education, in part because higher education depends, in terms of its standards, on something called the SAT or the ACT or some other test, which turns out to be a very poor predictor of performance. And yet, what it really is a predictor of is what kind of car your parents drive. Meaning, are your parents well-to-do? Well, then you're going to do well on the SAT. And why are you going to do well on the SAT? Because your parents have the money to hire someone to prepare you to take this exam, which you then may do well on because you've had the money to prepare for that test. Having taken the test, however, how well does that test predict performance in college, or how well does the LSAT predict performance in law school? Very little. What I know about most is performance in law school based on the LSAT. The LSAT at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, which is where I was given the most opportunity. I got 4 years of student grades and their LSAT scores. The LSAT predicted 14% of the variance in first-year law school. Did a little better second year. 15% of the variance. Meaning 85% of the time it was wrong. And yet we're relying on these kinds of metrics to determine who gets to go to the most elite schools and who gets to be in a position of leadership, a position of power. And so my point here is that we have to think about this as systemic, not simply individualistic. And it's not enough to make opportunities better for a few individuals to show that we're no longer prejudiced or racist or discriminating against people simply because of their race or their class, but that this is an opening on a much larger systemic problem. And if we don't resolve that, you'll have people like the kids who became obviously adults at Central High School blaming the quote-unquote niggers for what was happening when it was in fact the upper middle class whites who were redirecting the opportunities for the young people at Central High School, the young, poor, or working class kids.
Lani, I love it when you define that. Peniel, last comment.
Yeah, very quickly on that. In terms of policy-wise, though, if you said a new Great Society in 2014 or a new Deal, it would be around a few issues. One is not just mass incarceration, but just the criminal justice system, complete revamping, overhaul, so not just drug laws and sentencing, and then also handling recidivism, drug rehabilitation, and how do we get ex-felons back into our communities. And then what would we do if we get in mass incarceration about unemployment, because 1 million people would lose their jobs. So the second part would be employment, and real employment. What they did in the 60s were job programs that didn't give people jobs. There's enough infrastructure challenges that we have that we can employ many, many people just by transforming and investing in our infrastructure in the United States. And then finally, a few things. Schools, our public schools, one coda to what Lani was saying about Little Rock High, they did the special 50 years later in 2007 looking at Little Rock. All black, they had a special program for teenage moms, very, very poor, not a lot of opportunity 50 years later, right? And that was extraordinary to see. So what we don't talk about now is residential and public school segregation, and how those are accurate predictors for how people are going to do, especially when people are in high poverty school districts. Bill Wilson's work on poverty and high concentrations of poverty, and other sociologists have really looked at this. So you have to do mass incarceration, employment, public schools, but also residences, because we don't, like New York City, where I'm from, it is a scandal in terms of access to decent housing in New York City. The Bloomberg years completely transformed and destroyed the safety net for people who are homeless and lower income and even middle income. They gave the store away, including the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, where I have deep familial roots in. People are getting thrown out of their neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Harlem, because they were renters. They didn't own the decrepit housing that the city and private speculators like Bruce Ratner, have come and they've literally displaced tens of thousands of people in an American city that no one wanted to be in those parts of Brooklyn. And they're even going to Clinton Hill and East New York right now, and Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is the most historic black neighborhood in the United States. Southeast DC as well. Yeah, so stopping gentrification that's based on class and race, and having a gentrification where even poor people are going to have access.
Cambridge.
Yeah. I feel like we're just getting started here. We're going to have to wrap up. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. This series, the ART of Human Rights, will be an ongoing series for the whole year, 2014-2015. We're in the middle of our fall program right now. Two upcoming events that I want to call your attention to. On Saturday and Sunday, November 8th and 9th, a Boston area youth ensemble that's working with folks here at the ART is going to do an original production. It's a project that brings together high school students from around the Boston metro area to create their own theater piece, and this year the theme of the theater piece is going to be based on radicalism and dissenters, and we are going to occupy Oberon at 2:30 on Saturday, November 8th, and at 7:30 on Sunday, November 9th. Tickets are available and free and open to the public, so please do that. I'm super excited. I've been working with these kids for the last 6 or 7 weeks now, and they are extraordinarily talented. If you want to think about creating space for students to have activist voices and to be artists and to think deeply about history and politics, this is the thing you need to see. So I encourage all of you to come to that. And then on Tuesday, November 18th, Eve Ensler and I will be in conversation at Farkas Hall, which is the new college theater here at Harvard. And she and I will be in a conversation on stage called Politically Incorrect: Feminism and the Future of the Planet, not to be missed as well. Peniel Joseph, Lisa Coleman, Robert Schenkkan, Lani Guinier, thank you. It's been a privilege.